Many historians agree that the women's suffrage movement started with the famous Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, led by the suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which ended in the Declaration of Independence. However, during the Civil War, the movement was halted to deal with the secession of the South. Later, the movement was involved with the abolitionists trying to give black men their right to vote through the 15th Amendment. While the 15th Amendment was successfully ratified, the suffragists failed to get the women's vote added to the amendment. Suffragists Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the American Equal Rights Association, whose purpose was to petition and lobby the government. Due to disagreements between the radical and the conservative suffragists, the AERA split and created the National Women's Suffrage Association and the Women's Suffrage Association. The former was led by the radicals who wanted national suffrage, and the latter was led by the conservatives who wanted state legislation. Their statuses changed during the Progressive Era. Generally, middle-class white married women still do not work outside the home, and working women remain single and unmarried. However, since the middle-class women yearned for more, and so began to focus their effort on the suffrage movement, which explains why they were the driving force of the effort, as well as the newfound belief of getting out and lobbying for change. New jobs were being offered to women, like in department stores or in offices. Well-off women who were able to afford an education also started pursuing white-collar jobs, which were previously exclusive to white men. This novel idea that was spreading through the public fast was coined the term New Woman. To the right are photos detailing what the public thought of women during the Progressive Era. As mentioned before, women were supposed to stay at home and take care of their home and families, since they could not get an education or a job. But since they were feeling cooped up in their own homes, women went out and organized clubs that would benefit their community and perhaps the nation too. The first club organized, which sparked the movement, was the New England Women's Club, which is shown to the right. Women realized that they could use these clubs to lobby for improved labor laws for women and children, safe food and drug laws, and municipal reform, and proceeded to do so. But reluctant to listen to a group whose opinions did not matter legally, the government ignored these efforts for reform. Realizing their inferior political status, women started to fight for their right to vote. In order to have a greater chance of enfranchisement, women's clubs united in 1890 to form the General Federation of Women's Clubs. To the right is a photo of the organization. Another movement associated with the women's suffrage during the settlement. Another movement associated with women's suffrage is the settlement house movement. American social reformers began founding settlement houses in the late 1880s to respond to the growing industrial poverty and immigration boost. Women who were concerned for the unfortunate and were knowledgeable about domestic care, lack of safety protocols in the workplace, inadequate education opportunities, and woeful health care, yet unable to put their skills to use due to the lack of job opportunity, decided to construct these houses to fight against these problems. These settlement houses offered middle-class women the chance to live in a female-dominated space without having to be concerned about their duties in their own household, which they were unappreciated for. In 1889, Jane Addams and her friend Ellen Starr founded Hull House in Chicago, which would eventually be the most famous settlement house in the U.S. Another celebrated settlement house was the Henry Street Settlement and Visiting Nurse Association, founded by Lillian Wald in 1893, which provided residents of New York City's Lower East Side with indispensable community programs. The movement was a huge success, given that in 1887 there were 74 settlements in the U.S., and the number has ballooned to over 400 in 1890. At the end of the 19th century, women were mostly considered the moral guardians and protectors of the home. During the Progressive Era, female reformers used this ideology to argue that in order to protect the house, women should move into the public sphere where they could exercise their moral authority over issues such as public sanitation and education, which ultimately affected their home. In 1890, NWSA and AWSA merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Between 1896 and 1910, NAWSA initiated scores of campaigns at the state level calling for referenda on the issue of votes for women, but in the few cases in which the referenda was held, none resulted in votes for women. Beginning in 1910, however, under the growing aggressive leadership of Gowri a growing roster of states changed their laws to grant women to vote in state elections. In 1913, Alice Paul, a militant young leader of the movement, left NAWSA and created the Congressional Union, which became the Women's Party in 1916. The Women's Party picketed the White House and Congress. They especially targeted President Wilson because of his refusal to vote public support for their cause. Beginning in January 1917, the Women's Party had a perpetual picket stationed outside the White House for a year and a half, standing or marching in effort to influence public opinion and the nation's chief executive. In January 1918, the president yielded, making a pro-suffrage speech. The following year, Congress passed the 19th Amendment. The amendment was proposed in Congress on June 4th, 1919, and ratified by the states in August 18, 1920, and it finally gave the woman the right to vote. The first state to ratify the amendment was Illinois on the 10th of June, 1919, and the last state to ratify was Tennessee on the 18th of August, 1920. The ratification was split by one vote that was either for or against in the Tennessee House of Representatives in Nashville. Fortunately, Henry Thomas Burns, inspired by a letter from his mother, cast the deciding vote in favor of ratification, making Tennessee the 36th state to pass the amendment and providing the required 3/4 margin necessary for ratification. The floor was flooded with yellow roses, which was the symbol of the cause. The 19th Amendment was finally ratified due to the efforts of these people. Susan B. Anthony, a suffragist, abolitionist, author, and speaker, was also the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Also established the American Equal Rights Association in 1866 and created and produced The Revolution, a weekly publication that lobbied for women's rights in 1868. Well known for voting illegally and subsequently jailed, she refused to pay the fine. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an early leader of the women's rights movement, well known for writing the Declaration of Sentiments as a call to arms for female equality. Also president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She published a critique, The Woman's Bible, which was published in 2 volumes. Carrie Chapman Catt was the founder of the League of Women Voters and the International Alliance of Women, and came up with the winning plan to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920. Lobbying tirelessly on behalf of the amendment, Catt was a critical factor in federal victory for women. Alice Paul was a suffragist who led the successful campaign for women's suffrage, which resulted in the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. Also formed the National Women's Party with Lucy Burns in 1920. She supported the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment as well. Lucy Burns founded the Congressional Union and the National Women's Party with Alice Paul, and led the militant wing of the American suffrage. She organized the famous 1913 Suffrage Party in Washington, D.C. Burns also headed the NWP's lobbying in Congress, edited the NWP's journal, The Suffragist, and spent more time in prison than any other American suffragist.
Margaret Sanger was born on September 14, 1879, and she was the 6th of 11 children. Her father was an outspoken radical who always taught his daughter to speak up and say what she believed. And at the age of 50, her mother passed away after 18 pregnancies. 7 of them were miscarriages and 11 of them lived. Not a lot of hobbies back then. Her mother's death inspired her to become a nurse and care for pregnant women. In 1912, she left nursing to pursue a career for the New York Call, which was a newspaper magazine sort of, and she had a column called "What Every Girl Should Know," and the articles all dealt with sex education and women's health. And her work was censored because a lot of people thought it was like vulgar because they didn't want to talk about or like educate people on contraception. And while working among immigrant women, she was exposed to many examples of women who were forced into frequent childbirth because there was no contraception. They had no way to like prevent having a pregnancy. So they had to perform like their own ways of using contraception, which caused a lot of miscarriages. There was self-induced abortions because there was a lack of information how to avoid the pregnancies. The Comstock laws in 1873 prohibited access to contraceptive information, and it was a crime to import or distribute any sort of devices or medicine to prevent conception of babies. She decided to flee to England to avoid persecution, and once she left the United States, she had 100,000 copies of her pamphlet, Family Limitation, which contained sex education information regarding abortion and birth control, and there were methods for contraceptives and instruction on how to use them inside the pamphlet. After visiting a Dutch birth control clinic, she learned about diaphragms and began importing them to the States from Europe in order to combat the laws that oppressed women from using contraception. And she opened up her own clinic in 1916. She was arrested twice for breaking the law that prohibited distributing contraceptives and for running a public nuisance. She was offered a lenient sentence if she agreed not to break the law again, but she refused to comply because she thought it was important for women to be educated on their bodies and contraception and everything. So after the arrest, the birth control movement won a huge victory when the New York Court of Appeals issued a ruling that allowed doctors to prescribe contraception, which was not allowed before. And the publicity gained from the arrest and the court case helped her earn support of a lot of wealthy people who donated and provided monetary support for all her future efforts. And in 1921, the American Birth Control League, better known today as Planned Parenthood Federation of America, which was founded by her. The organization was successful in challenging the courts over the Comstock laws, which were preventing distribution and education of contraception. And the American Medical Association adopted contraception as a normal medical service, and it began to include in the curriculums of all medical schools.
Alright, so eugenics was probably one of the worst movements in American history. It was like they tried to make labradoodles and seedless grapes out of people with crossbreeding. So it originally stemmed from Darwin's On the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, which basically documented evolution. But some people wrongly interpreted that as if you put the right people together, you can make humanity like some sort of super race. So genetics weren't fully understood at the time, and given that, people didn't know that genetics had nothing to do with traits such as like you're going to become a criminal, you're going to become poor, you're going to be stupid, and they thought that that just came with the person and how they were born instead of how they were brought up. So, like during eugenics, a lot of people were sterilized forcibly by the government. Immigration was cut off, which was on the task, and those unfit to have children would not have children. And it's not that they didn't want to have children, they just were forced not to by the government. This is a poster for a Fitter Families contest, which is basically a beauty pageant, but entire families were put in the pageant. And then based on how athletic they were and how good they looked, they were given prizes to designate how worthy they were as a eugenics family. And the ideal family always won, which was a nice looking. A court case which basically started, or was a large part of eugenics, was Buck v. Bell, which took place in Virginia. So a 17-year-old mother, she had a kid, and then she was deemed unfit to have any more. And her kid wasn't very bad. Her kid was actually quite bright, but she was accused of being feeble-minded and being deficient as a human being. So the Supreme Court ruled that forced sterilization was ethical, and that when you're dealing with a facility, that you could sterilize them without their consent. Over the period of eugenics, over 60,000 people were sterilized without their consent in the US, and those people really never got compensated for that. The Racial Integrity Act 1924 was also enforced in Virginia, and it banned interracial marriage between anyone who was white and colored. If you were colored, you were 1/64th not white, which was being Native American, black, or any other. It lasted until 1967, until a Supreme Court ruling ruled that you couldn't really choose who to marry, or not to marry. Eugenics started to decline in the mid-late 1920s. Due to advanced research in science, people actually learned that genetics had nothing to do with those negative traits. And genetics really wasn't fully understood up until now. Not to mention that it was terribly unethical and morally wrong, just bad. And in Europe, like a lot of people compared eugenics to what the Nazis were doing with the Holocaust, and that kind of drove the popularity of it down a lot. Considering they were kind of using the same tactics that Americans were, and it just shed a really, really bad light. Eugenics was originally supposed to be based on science, but it eventually became a war of the middle and upper class on the poor, and the poor were seen as these terrible, terrible people who weren't fit to reproduce, instead of using actual scientific facts to choose who was fit.